you for joining us. And today, TIMCA is talking to John Malan. And John is Johannesburg-based musician and producer, studied and specialized in guitar at the Musicians Institute in Hollywood, California. And he played in a variety of bands. John's played in a variety of bands in many different genres, and has started digital music production in the 1990s and is an expert on a number of different programs and apps in that regard. John is currently writing, performing and recording for the band Cabal 19, and has been teaching music since the early 1990s and started teaching digital production in 1999. We at TIMCA got to know John as our music producer for the video Victorious by Elizabeth Elle, who is part of the team at TIMCA and is based in the United States. So John, really great to have you with us. And today we'll be talking about the topic of repetition in learning, and that's going to be very interesting. But first, if I can just ask you, I have given you a bit of an introduction, but if I could just ask you to tell us perhaps a little bit more about what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James. The bulk of what I do is teaching, so that warrants mentioning. So I teach music at a private school here in Johannesburg. I teach privately myself, and I teach a variety of topics from guitar performance and playing. I teach keyboard, drums, bass, music theory, production, digital music. So a lot of a spectrum. I started off as a guitar teacher, but slowly and surely started adding more to what I taught. Yeah.
And that's very much in line with the trends clearly that are happening globally. You do a lot of work with individual artists, John?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of production, that's something, I mean, I've in the past I used to do quite a lot of commercial work. A number of years ago, and like recently I just started doing some again because of the whole coronavirus thing. It's become something that's come up again, people working at home to do these things in home studios. But yeah, I work with individual artists. I have my whole life been a hired gun in terms of performing with other musicians and recording with them. I've always been the guy who comes in and does the guitar bits. That's usually been my role till about 4 years ago when I started doing my own stuff and my own music. Yeah.
Great. And your role in the video and the music production of Victorious, the song by Elizabeth Elle, which at the moment has just been released and is something that project that's quite close to our hearts at TIMCA. Really was a fantastic job that you did for us and Elizabeth on that. Yeah, how did you get involved with that?
So I knew your colleague Colin. I used to teach his son guitar, and Colin and I, over the years, his son and I became friends, and then Colin and I also became friends, kind of in a separate way. It's an odd thing, but so he asked me. He came up with the idea. He was writing a song with Elizabeth Elle, and he lyric-wise, and they were coming up with ideas, and they wanted someone to put some more musical input, and he asked me if I'd do it, and I did, and I guess they liked what they heard, so that's the song now.
It really is a wonderful project involved that you got involved with there with Elizabeth, who is a blind person living in New York, and sings about her role in the COVID-19 crisis, where she worked in a hospital in New York. And we have that information on the Elizabeth Elle website. And if you go to our TIMCA site or go to elizabethelle.com, you can look at that as well. But we're not talking about that anymore today. What we're going to be talking about is very much a topic very close to your heart, John, and in music, from a repetition point of view and learning, it's very much what we're talking about. And So yeah, it's really just to hand over to you to start to introduce the topic, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about it, just really how important.
Sure. I mean, so the one thing that's kind of a very important part of learning, I think, that is kind of a dirty word, is the idea of repetition. So repeating any task is often seen as kind of boring, but it's an entirely necessary step, I think, in learning, and more so than anywhere else, I think, in music, you have to keep repeating things. And when people talk about practicing a musical instrument, there is this idea that you're going to sit there and play things over and over and over and over and over and over again, and that is a crucial part of learning music. But on top of that, repetition needn't always be boring. Repetition isn't a new thing, and no matter what skill you're doing, what skill you're learning, should I say, whether it's juggling or calculus or how to fix a car, practice will make you better. The more you do something, the better you get at it. It's just it's a given thing. It's not something I invented, or it's not something new. It's something that we've known for a long, long, long time. So I think repetition is an important aspect, as I just mentioned, but also the strategies around how learning is repeated is often more important, because repetition on its own doesn't really lead to good learning, I don't think. And in my experience as a music teacher, is that so if you strategically impart repetition in practice, then it becomes far more interesting, and it's something that's really important, because it's not only does it let you learn the skill, it lets you gather the techniques necessary for the skill. And in the case of music, a lot of that is muscle memory. I hate that term, by the way, because it's got nothing to do with your muscles. It's really your brain. But it's called muscle memory, so we'll just stick to the norm. So you're developing the pathways in your brain, these shortcuts to achieving tasks that are second nature, the same way that we breathe and walk. I don't have to think about every time I take a breath. It's just I just do it. Or when I get up and walk, I don't have to go, okay, I need to put my left foot forward first. I've done it enough times that it's just second nature. And learning a musical instrument requires a lot of that, developing your playing to the point where that is exactly what it is. It's like walking. You just pick up your instrument and you start performing on it, and you're not thinking too hard about every single step that you're taking. But initially, obviously, you do have to, and repeating it, eventually it becomes this automatic process. So that's really, really important for it.
So to ask you, I mean, I know in when you're starting to learn music, I mean, there's probably scales and those things probably sound like swear words to a lot of youngsters who are learning music. But you're talking about the interventions that you can use to make it more interesting in terms of repetition.
Yeah, so I mean, the scales is a very difficult one, and that's one I struggle with all the time with my students, with new and old students, getting students to learn their scales. And usually that involves me saying, you must practice your scales, and that's like, people just roll their eyes and go, oh no, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to be doing that. So the step is like, I mean, my approach for that kind of thing, just talking about strategies around, for example, something like scales, and this can apply to anything. And I know this because I'm a learner myself. I don't only do music, and I have a hunger for education. I'm always trying to educate myself with things, how to learn new things, and some of them very mundane and very superficial, and some of them more in depth. I'll go into that some other point, but so I do know that at least some form of repetition is required. So I find that, for example, the boring repetition needs to be done, but in very small chunks and very small bites, and just do it once or twice, repetitively, and then you change the scenario or change the approach to how that repetition is going to occur. So it's still repetition, but now it's in a different environmental situation, or you're varying it in some way, but you're still doing the same thing. So these strategies are really important for music, for maintaining interest, just for yourself. I mean, I know when I started playing, I would practice crazy amounts of hours a day, 6 to 18 hours. And I know that I just was pushing through slogging, practicing scales, for example, just for like an hour at a time. And it's just insane. It was unnecessary, really. But that kind of thing, if you approach it properly, you can spend an hour actually playing scales, doing repetition of the concept of that scale and the idea of that scale and the finger movements around that scale without actually doing the same thing twice. And the way I do that musically is I'll say, okay, so let's do it. You're going to play the scale now, but you're going to do it to a funk backing, or a blues backing, or a jazz backing, or to this classical piece, or whatever. So you're still playing the same scale, but you now the context and what's surrounding what you're playing changes, and it changes the whole experience as well. And also creates an awareness of what is possible when this is mastered, when this something like, we're using a scale as an example, but something like a scale is used over and over again.
Yeah. As you say, John, I mean, that is a principle that certainly can be used in any other learning environment that you have. So, I mean, you know, if we compare scales to times tables in mathematics, it's a very, I mean, it might sound like a very similar concept.
Yeah. I mean, so what I was saying is that I learn a lot of things and I apply these same principles to those things, you know, so it's going to be ridiculous when I tell you like this, how many things I do, but I mean, I for fun, I do like doing maths problems. I was never very good at it at school, but it's something that I've gathered an interest in now that I'm older. And I do, you know, my parents, my mother used to love doing crossword puzzles. I like doing maths problems. it's something that I do. But there are a myriad of things that I do, and I use these strategies for that. So there are a couple of things in repetition, I know when I was learning, my teacher would say, just repeat this. That's what you need to do, without any clear goals of like, what am I trying to achieve with this repetition? And I think that's also, I didn't mention it before, but that's a really important aspect as well. It's like, why am I repeating this? How does this benefit me? Because otherwise there's really no point. And in a lot of musical curriculum that I studied, there is that approach. It's like, you just need to know the scale, so just practice it until it's automatic. And then I'd be like, okay, but musically, I have no idea what to do with this. Like, there's no application for this at all in my life, in my music. So that kind of thing. So having clear goals of like, why am I doing this? Whether it's because it will lead to some more knowledge that is preparing you for that greater knowledge, or because it's something that you'll be able to use practically in the following ways. These are the things, like you're practicing a scale so that eventually you can do A, B, C, or you're practicing a timetable so that you can do these tasks in mundane life, like working out your taxes, all the fun stuff. But or designing, I don't know, designing 3D models. I mean, so like, and that could appeal to someone who's maybe their end goal is that, you know. Multiplication becomes a really important element of that. So this is
in a musical context. Maybe I can ask you this. I mean, it's something I struggled with. I mean, I played the trombone way back, and you know, scales and just learning, as you say, just learning something for the sake of learning it, so that you just can play it. It didn't really train me, and I certainly didn't get the benefit of understanding what it would mean to play that same scale in a different key, or move it up a semitone, or to transpose, or whatever. So I certainly didn't learn any of those type of techniques. I just learned how to play a scale in a certain key. And I didn't really I didn't really have that concept of anything different.
Yeah, so the functional workings were missing. And I mean, a lot of what I learned, especially as a child at school, was that kind of approach. Not really explaining the whys, but just telling you what to learn. Like, learn this, but not really how the why or the how, and how it's functioning and how it connects to everything else. That kind of information is a bit missing. So repetition is important, but these ideas of like where it's leading and why you're doing it, and how you should approach doing it, these are very important elements that I think in terms of training. Another strategy in terms of repetition is to break it down into smaller things. Like often something like a scale for a beginner might be a bit overwhelming and too difficult to remember. I know if you're doing something like a trombone or piano, it's 7 notes, usually 5 to 7 notes, depending on the scale. And on guitar, you're usually doing an octave and a bit. So with the guitar, you're usually doing like 14 to 17 notes when you practice a scale. And just remembering those 14 to 17 notes, if you think of just like a telephone number, if it had that many digits, I mean, no one remembers telephone numbers anymore, but if you have to remember 14 numbers, which is essentially what you're doing in terms of playing and remembering what fret number you're on, what string number you're on, it does get difficult, and the repetition becomes boring and doesn't feel like doing. So small chunks, usually breaking pieces of information down into smaller elements and making sure that those elements make sense before moving on to the larger whole. I think that's a really big strategy. Often I'll just say, this is the whole, try it. If you're struggling, then break it down into the smaller particles and build up and understand what those little particles do, and then combine them together to get that whole again. Yeah, and that applies to, again, anything that I learn currently. I use exactly the same principles. I watch a lot of educational stuff online. I used to do a lot of courses, and now I just seem to do everything. I mean, face-to-face courses, now I seem to do everything online. And I always apply that. I find that often instructors will leap into an idea a little bit further than I can handle. So I'll have to break that idea into smaller bits and pieces that I can first master and then put together into the final process that he or she are trying to teach.
So in practicing this technique of breaking it down into smaller chunks, it gives the student or the learner an opportunity to master that smaller chunk first and have confidence. I mean, is that part of the technique that you're using?
Yeah, exactly that. Any skill or any element, anything that you're trying to learn, if you take the most basic element of it and start there, there's kind of a confidence that comes into the learner, the person who's learning, in that, I totally understand this. This is not complex at all. And so if you take an idea of something you're trying to teach and you break it down into 3 small pieces, let's say, and I'll use an analogy in a minute, but 3 small pieces, and you can say, okay, this is how the first piece works, and it's easy to understand and easy to digest, and creates a sense of confidence, like, okay, I get that, I understand that bit. And then we take the second bit and look at how that works together. This is how it works. And then, okay, I understand that. It might take me a few times, but okay, now I get that element of it. And then the third, and so on. So when you've got all 3, it's now how to link those pieces, and go like, okay, now I see the flow of logic in here. And it's often a flow of logic, regardless of what it is, even if it's a creative thing like painting or writing poetry, understanding. A lot of people will take up tasks like that. And I think writing and photography come to mind as 2 very big ones that people say. They can just say, I'm a photographer or I'm a writer. If you can hold a pen and make letters on a piece of paper, you can say I'm a writer. Or if you can press a little button on a camera, you can say I'm a photographer. But that doesn't really make you a writer or photographer. There's so much more to those particular skills. There's so much to learn about those particular skills that I haven't seen it much of late, but there was a period like in the late 90s to early 2010s where everybody was a photographer and a writer, whereas they really, to a large degree, really weren't. They lacked the actual skills that actually define those professions. I'm using those examples, but there are many others as well.
Same would apply in the musical context. I mean, certainly, I know from my own personal experience that, I learned in a sort of, we were in a small sort of military band type of situation in primary school, went into a brass band in high school, and we only worked in treble clef, and we never worked in bass clef. And then going into a military band situation later on, everything was in bass clef. So that made it quite difficult because some of that foundation was clearly missing.
So you're a trombone player playing in treble clef, is that what was going on?
Interesting, isn't it?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that really, as long as you're just transposing it down an octave or whatever. Like, yeah, I guess that works. It's not like they're totally alien concepts. But yeah, to then be presented with music in bass clef, that would be a problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
So again, yeah, that would mean you need to, as you say, the concept is very much the same, but so everything was so ingrained into me in the treble clef environment, it was actually very difficult then to be able to transpose in bass clef. So if I was playing bass clef and was asked to transpose or go up a semitone, it was very difficult for me.
Yeah, I mean, I find that very confusing because I often have to write parts for brass and bass, and my home base is also treble clef as being a guitarist. So that's where I work best, or write for pianos, I have to think about what the left hand's doing in the bass clef. So that, yeah, I find that. So I mean, so that kind of thing. Just in terms of that, like when you already know something and you have to apply. So it is similar. So it's not like you're suddenly learning something completely new. It is very similar and just making those connections between things. But to bring that back around to repetition in terms of like how do you adjust that? I mean, for me, I know that I struggled because even when I studied, I had to read in bass clef, even though I was playing a treble instrument. And so it meant hours playing in bass clef and trying to read bass clef stuff. So that's where repetition comes in again, and then you apply the strategies, breaking into small chunks. Like, don't do the whole clef, the whole vertical breadth of the clef. Just take 3 notes to start off with and work on those 3 notes and get used to those 3. And work on another 3 and then once you've got those 3, then add them together. So you got 6 notes and so on. And so you build. And that's the first thing. And then in terms of context, again, I could do musical context, just different styles. That's a contextual difference. But also, because I'm an electric guitarist, I could change the sound of my guitar to, for example, emulate a bass or emulate a trombone. If you have the equipment to do that kind of thing. And that also changes the context. So just changing the sound of my instrument made it interesting, even though I was playing the same thing. I was doing the same task and I was learning the same thing. I was just changing the environment of it a lot more. And that's
so if you were to pull that into a real life context or something, say in a mathematical problem for a youngster, it would be presenting the same problem but within a different type of format. So a practical example rather than looking at it on a paper example.
Yeah. So I think that's word sums, right? So word sums is a strategy for that in maths. I think that's what they're called, word something. And that is, I think that's a very good way of putting it, and then translating that into mathematical symbols, what you've just processed in your mind in terms of working that out into a mathematical symbol. I don't know if that's something that you use or that happens that much in maths education. My approach to maths is that I buy textbooks and I just go through them and do the exercises. That's how I do it. So in terms of that, a different context like that would be the primary way of doing it. But also doing, like, a lot of those word sums tend to be a bit abstract, I find. So making them a bit more relevant as well, like just situations where, I don't know, if you go down to basics, like just working out your VAT, on an exchange of goods, a transaction, and working out how much you're going to pay in tax on that.
Yeah.
So
we know from the data and what's been published that a lot of the students struggle with things like percentages, for example. And if one has to try and pull that back into, say, a musical context, perhaps, I mean, what would you find that are the concepts that perhaps some of your students struggle with the most? If it's a slightly abstract sort of concept, what would they struggle with the most, and how would you deal with that?
Okay, so a really great example for me, and that's something that I feel I've tackled in a really effective way, is this notion of improvisation. And because my background is that of jazz, blues, and rock, improvisation is a very big thing. I wasn't classically trained. I have done classic lessons, but there's not really an environment for improvisation. Not really, not like jazz, blues, and rock have. And the way that I was taught in most instruction approaches it is to say, here's the scale, just start playing the notes in the scale and it'll sound great. And that's not really the gist of it. So here's a situation where I'd be, well, there's specific notes within the scale that are more important than others. So let's focus on those notes first. So don't worry about the rest of the scale too much, except that you can play those notes arbitrarily at any point, but focus on the ones that are important. And I would highlight those, for example. So that would be something that people really grasp. Like when I first started teaching, which was early 90s, I'd say, okay, so here's a scale, just start playing. And people would just freeze and be like, I have no idea. They'd just play the scale up and down, and that would be it. And for some reason, that's something that I kind of got quite easily when I was learning. But so I struggled to understand why people were struggling with it. But then I realized that they're very basic principles. I never really thought about it. I just kind of, and as with many skills, like some people just get it. And I think I just got it without knowing how I was getting it. And then kind of reverse engineering my approach and going like, okay, this is what I'm actually doing without realizing that this is what I'm doing. So these notes are important, so focus on these. So that's how you would break it down and say like, this is a smaller chunk. You don't have to think about everything. Just think about these specific notes and go try and play those notes more than any other notes as you're improvising. So that would be a real life example of how to break it down. Then slowly add in more. So if you add in this note, this is the effect that it'll have musically. So be strategic about when you play this note, not just play it arbitrarily. Like, as I've told you before, you should do now, don't do that anymore, and now start being more thoughtful about when you play a note and that kind of thing. So yeah, that'll be a good one.
So as we sort of wind down now in that sort of in the last few minutes of the time we have, just in terms of if you were to look at the role of repetition in learning and had to highlight maybe 2 or 3 key points, and I know you've mentioned them as we've gone through the discussion today, what would those 2 or 3 points, so if there's anything that you're going to take away from this discussion, what would those 2 or 3 points be?
Well, there's one that we haven't discussed, which I'd include in those 3. But the first one is that learning is important. Repetition is important. Learning, of course, is important, but repetition in learning is vital. And it's often a dirty word, like it's something that people don't like the idea of. So that it is important, and that needs to be accepted. The second thing would be that strategic repetition would make it less of a dirty word and would make it something that's understood and something that people would do. And the third element of it is when you realize that and you are doing your repetition, something that gets developed in young learners that I teach, and even in adults, that is that by focusing and doing that repetition and just making yourself do that, and even when you make it as interesting as possible, sometimes it isn't. And when you do that, it does engender a sense of self-discipline. Like, it creates self-discipline as a skill, a personal skill. And self-discipline is a really important skill, and self-motivation to actually go, I need to do this. I know why I'm going to get to a certain goal in my playing or when I'm learning. So I need to do this. So I need to motivate myself to do it, and I need to have the discipline to sit and at least do it for a few minutes or whatever it's going to be, an hour, however it plays out. So that would be the third thing for me, is this idea of instilling self-discipline and self-motivation, discipline and self-motivation in the learner. Those are two really important skills in life, I think.
So repetition is important, that we need to make sure, but strategically deal with it strategically. Don't just do repetition for repetition's sake. And then finally, as you were saying, make sure that this whole concept of self-discipline and being able to actually tackle these tasks and in that way is important.
It's not just only the task you're learning, it's about your development as a human being in terms of doing the repetition. It develops you in ways beyond just the skill that you're tackling at hand. That's important. And what I have found just in terms of this, with repetition and self-motivation and discipline, is that any task can be learned to a degree. And a lot of people think of things like such things as skills like drawing and singing as like, I can't do them, so I'll never be able to do them. Or even, I've heard a lot of people say that about maths. Oh, my brain just isn't wired for, I can't do maths. And all of that is nonsense. You can actually, if you're interested in doing a task, it will take time. It will take a lot of repetition. It will take a lot of self-motivation and discipline. And if you do it strategically, you'll get there, and you'll get there in a shorter time than you'd expect, really.
Yeah. And that's a fantastic lesson, certainly for everybody listening around that. And it ties in very well with what we driving in TIMCA, which is very much around development and cognitive development, and the development of what we call agency, which is really around that whole being able to think and act for yourself.
Yeah, it is agency. Yeah, taking control. Yeah,
which is wonderful. So thank you very much, John. This is just
thanks, James.
That really been a great discussion, and it takes me back to my days as well in a bit in the music world. But it really is I wish you all the best. We're going to be chatting again next month, also on the second Wednesday of every month. We're going to be having a discussion with John, and looking forward to that. And thank you for joining me today on the TIMCA Talks 2. And if you do want to get hold of John, these details are going to be putting up on the screen now. The information there, if you're wanting to get hold of John, please go to his website, www.guitarlessons.co.za or www.mechasonic.com. And that's very important. And John, as we were saying earlier on, many years of experience and working in a number of different areas as far as music production, and particularly in guitar and teaching in guitar. But as you can hear from the discussion we've had today, really does have a very holistic view in terms of that, and really appreciate that, John, in what you've been able to share with us today. So we're going to be ending off now, so it's just really to say goodbye from my side. And please, if you have enjoyed watching today, which hopefully you have, please come back to the TIMCA channel, so TIMCA Global on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you again, and I look forward to chatting to you again, John, next month. And
thanks, James.
Topic. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Really great. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.